fund accounting essentials, how to prevent fund accounting mistakes before they begin. So on this one, these 3 words, I honestly didn't know what these were about when I started, and it's okay if you don't. And we were going to cover them in a bit of detail today. I had, when I started, I'd not been on any free webinars like this. Certainly not not being invested in by my charity in any sort of specific bookkeeping training. Totally to my detriment, as I always said. And I can't overstate enough just how important it is to understand these terms. And when I say that, I don't just mean like technically the theory of them, the what they mean, but actually what it means in real life for you, for your charity, for your funds, for the nuances of your charity and your how those work, because you can know it, but until you've actually gone through it and practiced it and looked at it and analyzed your own funds and made sure. So I want to help us do that a little bit today, and I'm going to tell you another story of another charity, again, no names mentioned, that had a bunch of different funds. They had firstly a unrestricted fund, as you'd imagine, and the unrestricted fund, the key test really for this, if you're not aware, is that the question you should always be asking, is this unrestricted, is if the trustees have complete leeway. Do the trustees have complete leeway to decide on how it's used? If the answer is yes, and they can use it on anything to fulfill the charity's aims, it's got to be on the charity's aims, then it is an unrestricted fund. So at some point in the past, though, this charity had taken a chunk of their unrestricted funds and they'd moved them into a designated fund to hold their minimum reserve. They decided that they wanted to have a reserve just put to one side, and so they'd done that. The trustees had ring-fenced this money. That's really what the designated fund does. It's just ring-fencing that money. Now, that money is still unrestricted. It can be moved back. If the trustees decide they want to designate it somewhere else, they are more than able to do so. It is not a problem. Now, I came in at this point to help them streamline their accounts, and they told me they also had a restricted fund. Now, restricted funds, as many of you know, are defined as funds that have got some sort of specific legal, obviously, restriction imposed on them, as the name implies, restricting how they can be used. This charity had a restricted income fund for sort of responding to emergency situations when they were delivering their charitable aims. If there was a situation, they could respond with this fund, and it had been used a bit, and so it was a little bit lower than they would have liked it to be, and they kind of had a minimum they wanted to keep it at. And so they said to me, oh, it's okay, we'll just move some funds from our reserve fund into it, and we'll top it back up. And so I just sort of started asking a few questions about that. And as I did, it turned out that they actually had a restricted grant given to them about 3 years before that had ended up in this designated fund with the other money because they had actually been doing bank accounting instead of fund accounting. And so you suddenly got this mix, this bit of a mess, bit unclear of where's this money, why is it there, what was it for? And the risks here are quite real. You've got overinflated unrestricted funds, right? So you think you've got more unrestricted funds than you have. There's obviously this risk of spending restricted funds on the wrong thing, probably without even knowing. You could have run down that money and you wouldn't know. And then, if you go down that route, you ultimately can end up breaking trust. Charities Commission, worst case, we've seen it in the news, in the high-profile cases in the last year of charities where the trustees haven't dealt with the money in the right way, and it's we don't want to be there. None of us want to experience that, and so it's really, really important, as I say, to understand what this is. And so what I had to go through a process with them. This is where we ended up. We went back, do a review of the grant. What was the actual restriction? Let's get the paperwork out. And then it was clear that we needed to have a separate fund. So we created that separate fund, and we've made sure that that money that was in the wrong fund is moved across into that restricted fund. In that process, they go from that place of not realizing they've got a problem to they're not managing their donations in a compliant way. They've got all that risk to knowing the problem, knowing how to fix it, knowing that they've reduced the risks, and they've got that confidence that their accounts are nice and compliant. So I want to encourage you to, one of your takeaways from this is to make sure that you are reviewing your funds. Certainly as a bookkeeper, I make sure that my charities accounts, on a monthly basis, we're looking at each of the different fund types. And even though we think, oh, we know what, of course we know what the income is, we're double checking, particularly for any, material grants or material income. Hey, is this in the right place? Has it got the right documentation? Has it got the, are we confident that our designated fund is just designated money? Are we confident that our restricted fund is just restricted and it's in the right restricted fund and it's being spent on the right things? And I can't encourage you enough to go and have that review, especially if you've not done it for a while, and just make sure, because this charity that I'm talking about, they'd been there for a number of years, and it's just really, really important to nail that down. Now, there is also restricted endowment funds. These are a whole nother kettle of fish, so we're not really going to cover them in detail today. I can see Mr. White laughing at me about that. Absolutely. So endowment funds, most small charities don't really tend to have them, but just be aware they are there. And in summary, for this particular part, this is kind of where we're at. All right. And this is perhaps a good slide when you get the notes to print off and stick on your wall next to your computer. So unrestricted funds, usable at the discretion of the trustees, as long as it's on their charitable objectives. The key test being they have absolute discretion how it's spent. And I'm amazed at how many times I find money in restricted funds that actually, when you actually ask the question, have the trustees got complete leeway? There's some little area somewhere where they actually, it isn't. So just worth asking that question all the time. Do the trustees have leeway? Then you've got your designated funds. So that's your earmarked, ring fenced, but can still be moved. No legal obligation to restrict them. And then finally, your restricted funds, specific restrictions imposed by the donor potentially, or by the fundraising process, or if there's a legal process in terms of endowments and that kind of stuff, then that would come with that as well. Just being aware that once the money is in the restricted fund, you really aren't moving it around to any other funds. Okay, so the income comes into that fund, and then it should be spent from that fund. It starts to get complicated, and there are ways that it could leave that fund, but you're usually, you start talking to Charity Commission about doing that, and it's beyond the scope of this. But as a general rule, restricted fund income comes in and is spent from there. So charity A, it works with animals at risk of extinction. A donation is received and the donor states a preference for the money to be spent on hedgehogs. Is this restricted or unrestricted donation? What do you think? So the key here is, I want to point out that the question was, the statement from the donor was that there was a preference for it to be spent on the hedgehogs. And so for me, this would potentially quite easily be a unrestricted fund, because there's a preference. It's not actually being said it must. So if the donor had said, I'm giving you this grant and you must spend it on hedgehog houses, right, then you would need a hedgehog house fund. Okay, that preference, you may have some leeway there. So the trustees might say, well, actually, there's a preference. We want to honor that. We'll put it in a designated fund for the hedgehogs. But later on, if the donkeys need it, we can move to there. So it does come down to the wording. They might want to go back to the donor and say, hey, what did you actually mean? That's always a good option if you're not sure. The key is we want to be very clear in our minds that we understand what the donor is saying and what their intention was when they gave it. And so that preference thing is a key word there in my mind, making it unrestricted. So charity B is provides various services for disabled children in the community, and it receives £1,000 donation. Very kind donor from a parent of a beneficiary, and they're specifying that the money must be spent on a specially adapted laptop. Will the laptop ever become unrestricted? Here's the results. So most of you think no, that it will. Will this ever become unrestricted? And you think no. This is a bit of a tricky one, all right? But the key here is that the restriction is only on buying the laptop. Okay, so remember the wording here was that they received £1,000 donation who specified the money must be spent on a specially adapted laptop. So if they had said it must be spent on the laptop and that laptop must be used by Johnny, then that asset then would be, okay, it's now restricted to Johnny's use, or restricted to a particular place, or some other restriction. But actually, if you look at the wording here, the £1,000 donation from a parent has said you must buy the laptop. So the laptop itself, they can't use it to spend it on something else. They can't buy, you know, some other a TV. They've got to buy the laptop. All right, but now that they've bought the laptop, that laptop itself is not necessarily a restricted asset. And again, if there was any questions, we're not quite sure, what did they actually mean? Did they actually mean that they were expecting it to be used by somebody solely, their sole use? Then maybe you'd want to clarify that. But just on this one, on that wording there, it is, I would say, the answer, yeah, will it ever become unrestricted? Yes. After it's been purchased, that would be the case. However, you can see the kind of nuances here. It's not a once you learn the word restricted, unrestricted, that it's all sorted. There's every single time you have a case, then you end up with needing to analyze what it is. Charity C is a local youth centre. All right, it needs some new kitchen equipment. The pool table also needs to be replaced. It holds a fundraising event in the community. Should the funds raised be treated as restricted or unrestricted? Again, there's no vote for this, but just have a think. What do you think? Is that going to be restricted funding or unrestricted? If this was your charity, what would you be thinking? So my point I just want to bring out here is that how you communicate an appeal, if you've communicated it in the way those words there said, it really does make a difference to how it could be restricted or unrestricted. Okay, so for example, on this particular one, it's not 100% clear what your plan is. So it could be that you're saying, well, we think we're just going to spend whatever we get either on the kitchen or either on the pool table. But the actual individual may have understood that they're giving specifically to one or the other. Okay, so the wording is not particularly straightforward. So a better way perhaps might be to say, we're going to spend 50% of it or 80% of it on the kitchen, and whatever's left will go on the pool table. That way it's clear. So just be very careful how you approach your appeals for money. Make sure if you want to make it unrestricted, that you make sure your wording doesn't restrict it accidentally, and making it as clear as possible is really clear. So if people are thinking in this case that they're buying a pool table and they don't get a pool table, they might have a problem with it. But just watch out on how you do your appeals. I knew a charity that ended up restricting a massive set of donations unintentionally to buy nappies for their project when they really didn't need that many nappies. So they ended up with loads and loads of cash that they had to spend on something that it wasn't that easy to spend on. Charity D is an independent school. An alumnus who has fond memories of the school has donated £5,000, but specified that this must not be spent on the rugby team. What do you think? Restricted or unrestricted? They clearly did not have a good time with the rugby team. So what do you reckon? All right. My point being here is that negative restrictions are still restrictions. Okay. And so in this case, it would be a restriction because they can broadly spend it whenever they want, but the rugby team's lucked out. All right. And again, with this, sometimes I see charities who have got quite a big grant, and the grant will have terms and conditions in it that say things like must not be spent on redundancy, must not be spent on closing the charity down, and those kind of, well, that's not going to happen to us kind of things, and they just lump it in unrestricted funding. And you just got to be asking those questions: are any of those actually still very broadly restricted? Even though it's broadly restricted, do you need to be considering putting it in a restricted fund that's got, you know, very similar category setup to the general fund, but it just marks it to honor the fact that there was somewhere in the terms and conditions some sort of broad restriction. So just paying attention to detail around your the terms and conditions of your grants and what the donors have said is really important.